Additionally, China just completed its first manned spacewalk. It successfully sent 3 astronauts to the beginnings of their space station, what they will call an international space station.
The Tiangong.
Heavenly Palace. Beautiful. And so this ideological war is even extending into space. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to dominate space, and if it does, it will be able to deny access to anyone that doesn't play by the party's rules. Already, they are developing space weapons that can blind U.S. satellites, which, if that happens, say goodbye to GPS. That would not only hurt Uber, which is the American version of Didi, for those who don't know.
Well, I think actually,
as well as military GPS.
You joke, but as soon as it becomes like that, that's a sign that,
that's right,
that they've won the war. That, like, if we start referring to Google as the Chinese version of Baidu, or the American version of Baidu, or whatever, right?
Twitter, America's version of Weibo.
But if they destroy the American GPS system, there's always China's competing system,
exactly,
which is called the
Beidou.
Beidou, yeah.
Which they only finished everything last year. Like, they launched the last satellite
just in time for us to all switch over to their system.
But this is really a huge threat. China is teaming up with Russia. Last space race was U.S. versus Russia. Now it's going to be U.S. versus Russia and China. It's already not so good. And China and Russia are working to be the first to build a moon base, be the first to have an orbiting station around the moon.
Remember when Newt Gingrich ran for president back in 2012?
He was a prophet.
And he wanted to build a moon base, and everybody was like, this guy is so nuts,
And it really is a shame, because America's enemies were not joking around with this. We are in a very dangerous situation if Russia and China control space. Space warfare is essentially already here.
Yeah, I think that people think of, Star Wars or something. When you think space warfare, you think of like pew, pew, pew in space, but that's not really what you're talking about.
In space, no one can hear you, pew, pew, pew.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. But also, like, if you look at what the U.S. Space Force is, like, it's not a force in space the way the Navy is a force in the seas. It is a force that is almost exclusively on the ground on Earth, but is doing a whole bunch of things related to objects in space, or like, robotic or, smart objects in space, satellites and whatnot. And yes, we'll eventually have spacecraft, but that's perhaps quite a long ways out.
And this is a good distinction, too, because most of America's space activity has been done by NASA, which is a civilian agency, or more recently, private companies like SpaceX. China, their space program is run by the People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party itself.
Yeah, that's a little scary.
It shows you the difference. Like, this is China's space activities are a military operation.
Well, I mean, to a degree, the Communist Party considers everything a military operation, including its private companies, with quotation marks, operating around the world, like Huawei, for example.
Yeah, they call it civil-military fusion. Everything, and this goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of the podcast, everything is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And by extension, it's military.
It's like, every time there's some new law that Congress in the U.S. is considering, like a surveillance law or something like that, there's always people in Congress who are like, I don't think the government should have that much power, right? And, in China, every time there's something that they want to do that's going to give the Communist Party more power, like, okay, they just take it.
I was just thinking about how the problem here is that so much of the world just doesn't understand this about the Chinese Communist Party, about the Chinese regime.
I think it's kind of taboo to even mention ideological conflicts in this day and age.
Yeah, because it feels like we're over that. That's so 1960s.
Yeah, everyone has their different values. The U.S. shouldn't force its values on China.
Well, I wasn't even thinking about that part of it. I was
think
thinking about That's tied into it, but I was just thinking about the whole like, oh, we don't want to call it a
Cold
War
Wars, yeah.
because that's just not like there's something distasteful about using that
We're
term.
more civilized. We're at the end of history now. We're above that.
And
If we're not careful, we will be at the end of history.
Yep.
well, I was thinking about this guy we wrote about for headlines, Ian Lipkin, the Columbia University professor, who he had been one of the signers of that opinion piece in Nature Medicine that was saying that, oh, well, there's probably no way that this could have come from the coronavirus could come from a lab. And then, it turns out that he has all of these ties with the Chinese Communist Party because
he got the top award for foreign scientists at a ceremony presided over by Xi Jinping. He got an award from Dr. Shi Zhengli, the bat woman, the one who was doing coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She gave him an award.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the thing, right? If you treat China like it's just a normal country, just like France or the UK, what struck me about looking at the stuff about Lipkin is that Columbia University splashed this information as press releases, right? They were like, oh, yes, China is honoring one of our professors with the top scientific medal presided over by Xi Jinping. Or, China is awarding him, he got another medal last year that was commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's rule over China. And it was done at the Chinese consulate, like the consul general gave him the award, all this, this fancy stuff. And so if it is the UK or France or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, that is really prestigious, right? But then that award that he got last year was partially given by the Central Military Commission.
Mm-hmm.
It's just these things that, if you treat China like a normal country, like, oh yeah, that's great that he got these awards. If you treat them like a authoritarian regime that's committing genocide, it's like, do you really want to be splashing that all over the front page of your university that like your professor got an award from a country that's committing genocide?
It makes me think of recently we had Youngmi Park, the North Korean defector, on, and she was sharing with us her experience at Columbia University and how this kind of woke ideology has taken over the school, and it can have massive foreign policy effects.
Well, in a generation when like the national leadership is all like graduating from these Ivy League universities and they're coming to government with whatever the ideology they learned in university.
Or even right now, like this kind of ideology could make, the leadership at the school feel more comfortable with China, that the Chinese Communist Party is doing good things or whatever. And so now you have a professor with really disturbing ties to the Chinese Communist Party actively arguing against a lab leak hypothesis, making it so no one can talk about that that's just a fringe conspiracy theory. That's already having a huge impact.
I mean, I'm not even saying that he's necessarily doing this out of some kind of because he's a stooge for the Communist Party or anything like that. It's just that he started working in China after the SARS outbreak in 2003. And so, he worked with all these scientists and I'm sure they did some good things in terms of like, building, a better pandemic response system in China or whatever. But then it would have worked great if
it had been designed in a way that didn't rely on the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, what happened was that people were afraid in Wuhan to report it. Right.
This is one of those stories
that we've kind of forgot about. Yeah, the design. It wasn't the design of the system. It was that the system was also under a communist system where nobody wants to be the first to give bad news because then you get responsible and you get in trouble for it.
Yeah, they designed a system that would have worked in the U.S.
Right.
But it's because nobody understands the ideological difference of the Chinese Communist.
Well, it's like you can design a building that's a great building, but if you build it on a sand dune, it's not going to work as intended.
Well, my point here was more that, from this guy's perspective, it's not necessarily that he was bought off by the CCP I mean, some people are, but not everybody needs to be.
I'm sure he thinks he's independent and very, very smart.
And, doing a good thing, right? Like working with scientists in China to prevent global panic. Like this
is the failure to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is fundamentally evil. And it's a failure to recognize this ideological battle that is happening.
But this is what happens to a lot of people.
Yes, that's why we're not doing so well.
This is what happens where you kind of go to China and it's, these great, beautiful skyscrapers and the high-speed trains and, you see everything is going so wonderfully and they're like, oh, you can come be a guest lecturer at our university. We're looking for more prestigious scientists to work with us.
The Chinese Communist Party is very good at playing on the...
Egos
of the elite.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even have to be people who are elite. Like
who think they are.
I know people who they understand what's happening in China because they're friends with me and they know what's happening, right? But they've gone to China and there's still a little bit of that, when they talk about their trip there, even though they weren't kind of wined and dined at 5-star restaurants, they still have a little bit of that, like, oh, Shanghai, even though they know that there are huge, massive human rights problems. There's something that's kind of a little bit blinding about seeing that.
They're blinded by the lights. But I can see that. And it's also part of the whole, what the Communist Party does for tourists, and increasingly so, is if you go to visit China on business or as a tourist, like, they will always steer you towards certain things that are designed for you to see. So Beijing and Shanghai and a few other cities are all kind of designed this way. And it's increasingly difficult to just like go off somewhere and see other parts of China that are just like not so good.
And this is the real risk, because if people fail to recognize this ideological war now, it won't be long before the Chinese Communist Party can supplant the U.S. As we were saying, if it has its own capabilities in space, its own economic system that's self-sustaining. And then, very quickly, we will come to realize the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party.
I mean, they've been telling us all along. We just kind of don't pay attention to that part.
Yeah.
It's like we believe them when they say, give us money and it'll help us reform. But we don't believe them when they say actually true things like, we are going to invade Taiwan. We are going to decouple. We are going to take over this, we're going to dominate technology and innovation and manufacturing. Like, why are we not listening to the true things they say, and instead we're listening to all the lies they tell us?
I mean, also they say those things pretty directly, but there's the other stuff that they say about, the shared future of mankind, win-win cooperation. It's all kind of with that type of language.
You're right. It's so beautiful.
Yeah,
you're right. You know what? Let me retract what I said. I think we should just try to establish a win-win mutual cooperation with China, and it'll help them, adopt our values.